So I'll be brave if you're brave. I'll be brave, but only if you're brave.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome back live and in person to the Lung Cancer Living Room. We finally made it back to in-person meetings, and I, for one, could not be more thrilled. So thank you all so much for coming. Thank you all online who might be watching from your very own living rooms tonight. We're so happy to have you here. Tonight, we're talking about the next wave of precision medicine, which I think is really exciting. You guys have heard us talk about precision medicine, what that is and what that means for quite a while now, thank goodness. I know some of you in the room tonight might have Dr. Neal as your healthcare provider, which is fantastic. We're so grateful for you being here. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. Before we jump into the next wave, for the folks who might be newer to this space, newly diagnosed and not really understand what that means, we're going to be talking about precision medicine as it is today. We talked about how for decade after decade after decade, I think it was probably a half a century, the needle didn't really move much for lung cancer patients. It was the same old, sort of same old. So starting with sort of chemoradiation combination, then we really moved into this, into this targeted therapy space. So can you talk a little bit about where we were? Like I said, chemoradiation, targeted therapies, IO, and then we're going to jump right into some more specifics.
I jumped into the middle of the exciting times, the beginning of the exciting times in lung cancer. Couldn't have anticipated, despite doing some research in immunology, that, we'd have the major breakthroughs that we did in immunotherapy. But in the, early days of lung cancer, stage 4 lung cancer, it was a decision between bad chemotherapy that caused a lot of side effects and choosing just to get supportive care. And, there really was a decision of saying, let's just focus on quality of life alone. A lot of the early clinical trials in lung cancer, including the first trial in erlotinib, the EGFR drug, was unselected patients and compared to placebo, which now we run clinical trials and we'd never dream of running a placebo-controlled clinical trial where the alternative was really just supportive care. Best supportive care, we call it, instead of placebo. We'll do placebo, but it's like, something plus placebo versus something plus something new, right? There's always something in there. But, a lot of those best supportive care clinical trials, we found that there were certain subgroups of patients that were doing exceptionally well. Like the 19-year-old with ALK-positive lung cancer or some of the early patients with EGFR mutant lung cancer, where they went on these clinical trials of unselected groups and second-line therapy, and suddenly the tumor melted away, and nobody had ever seen anything like that before on a clinical trial with chemotherapy.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty crazy when you think about how differently people respond to different therapies, right? No two lung cancers are alike, effectively, right? And that's basically what precision medicine is. So when we say precision medicine, what do we mean? And I know, again, there's a lot of veterans in this room who understand that terminology, but for those who might be new to the game or coming back and watching this post live, what does that mean?
In a way, it's like AI, right? You can just kind of throw it out there and it sounds cool. Personalized therapy, precision medicine. As physicians, we always want to personalize our therapy. There's algorithms out there and we could figure out, follow A to B to C. But once we meet a patient, figure out what's really important to them, we're instantly personalizing out of all of those myriad options, like, what's the right path forward? I like to think about things like, what is the best possible case from today forward? Not focus on the past and what happened. That's for other people to worry about, but let's take today, whatever today is, and let's say, what's the most realistic, best possible case, and how can we do that? There's always a million things that can go badly. We all worry about those things. But what's that best possible case and how can we see that playing out? And I think precision medicine, when we think about it, is saying, what can we understand about the people and what can we understand about the cancer and how can we put those two things together to make the best therapy with the fewest side effects, that makes the most sense.
So from a diagnostic standpoint, assuming I'm a person who's sort of been going through this process, something's been found, and now I've had my scans, and maybe I've had a biopsy, and it's found to be non-small cell adeno. What absolutely needs to happen next for that patient?
There's a lot of kinds of lung cancer. Small cell lung cancer is a very unique subtype. It's less than 10% now. 90% is non-small cell. It's a funny name, right? You know, it's not the small cell. That's like, but we're stuck with the name. Within that non-small cell, there's adenocarcinoma that's glandular-like. There's squamous cell cancer that's skin-like. There's neuroendocrine large cell. There's kind of not otherwise specified. But within that non-small cell lung cancer, there's a lot of different subtypes. And that's just what the pathologist sees. That's what they could see 100 years ago under the microscope. But now with DNA technology, we know that the genetics of the cancer are different than the person that the cancer came from. So when we think about where did cancer come from, lung cancer came from a cell in the lungs that was normal and then got mutations and then started to grow, and all those normal programs that say, don't grow, don't do that, don't divide, got overridden. And so a series of genetic mutations have caused it to grow, form a tumor, or even spread around the body. And understanding those mutations can tell us a lot more about the cancer than just what it looks like under the microscope.
Yeah, and I think this is such an important part of the conversation. I think there's still some discrepancy there. I mean, we definitely know the non-small cell adenocarcinoma patients should be tested. Sometimes the squamous cell patients, right? How is that determined?
I think we're getting to the point where genetic sequencing of the tumor to figure out how it's different, how it's abnormal, you know, what's making it tick, what's making it grow, is getting to be more standard across all solid tumors. And, you know, I think non-small cell adeno, certainly we'd all say somebody who hasn't smoked, who has adenocarcinoma, is high likelihood of finding a mutation that we can target with a pill therapy. That's true. But we're starting to understand that there's other mutations that can help us decide, you know, are there treatments that'll work a little better? Are there treatments that won't work as well in other kinds of cancers too? So increasingly, Danielle, I'm sequencing most of these tumors, you know, and I think we're reaching that point where next generation DNA sequencing is unbelievable, right?
We don't have anything to lose by sequencing everyone.
When we
Right.
started in this, you know, when we started with EGFR mutations, there was debate about like whether EGFR mutations sensitized to drugs like erlotinib. There was debate, or was it just like something else that was sensitizing? Was it EGFR amplification or something else? So, you know, sequencing EGFR was a couple of $1,000s and could be done in a few weeks. Now we can sequence hundreds of genes across full exons for a couple of $1,000s in a couple of weeks. So we can do tissue directly, which is the most sensitive. You know, you're saying what color are the needles within the pile of needles?
Yeah.
Or we can do liquid biopsy, which is kind of like what color needles can we find within the haystack, right? But both of those technologies have gotten so much better in understanding these genetic mutations inside the cancer that I think more information is better in general.
Yeah, so when we're deciding who receives the biomarker testing, you mentioned erlotinib earlier, which for those of you in the room who have been on it, and I know many of you have, we're talking about Tarceva, right? And most of you have progressed to Tagrisso and, you know, whatever since then. But when that first happened, we were primarily testing never smoking Asian women, right? Like that's what it looked like. And so when I say who should we be testing, I'm kind of like, how do we get to that point where we've gotten to even in the EGFR sort of mind space where it's no longer just never smoking Asian women, right? Like how do we get to that place where we're looking at other forms of non-small? We talked about squamous or even small cell. Like is there anything kind of coming down the pike that we should be looking at or thinking about as it relates outside of adenocarcinoma?
I think the core DNA sequencing, DNA testing, looking for those important genes that make cancer cells grow. And the other half of it is these genes also make cancer cells not die. Like there's two programs of like, there's the program of grow abnormally, and there's the program of, you know, suppress the death pathways that are normally controlling all of this. understanding that whole gene profile and understanding how many mutations there are in a cancer can really help us personalize therapy. So for all the targeted therapies that we have, like we have 10 targeted therapy, 10 targets and multiple targeted therapies. We have immunotherapy, understanding the prediction. But I think for stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer today, I would advocate for sequencing the tumors and understanding. And there's not a small number of patients that are never smokers with squamous or other that have targetable mutations that might not have been found otherwise had we not looked at them.
Yeah.
And that one patient is very important.
If we miss, one of the core fundamentals is I believe positive results, right? We believe all the labs and, a positive result is believable, but a negative result just reduces our probability that there's some result there to find. So, an alternative explanation, so there's drivers. We think about these genes that cause the grow signal. We call all those drivers. There's not usually 2 of those at the same time. So if we find one driver, we say we can stop.
Stop looking.
But if we don't find anything that looks like a driver, then maybe more testing is indicated until we find one.
So you mentioned that there are 10 targets with FDA-approved therapies, right, that we know about right now. But there are also potentially things in clinical trials, and I think this is where it's relevant when we're thinking even outside of non-small cell adenocarcinoma.
I think about the fundamentals of cell biology. A tumor is a cell, and that cell comes from people, but it's different. It's got a lot of genetic changes. So, one time a patient of mine said something about your tumor, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, that's not my tumor. That's that tumor over there, right? That's different,
Right,
That's the tumor. And it's true. Like, it is genetically very different than the person that it came from. That's, what allowed it to exist in the first place.
Right.
So when we think about, that tumor and the biology, the fundamental change is the DNA, we think. And there's some changes around the DNA that we're starting to understand but are complex to figure out. Chromatin state, what pieces of DNA are open and expressed and what pieces of DNA are silenced, like really complicated stuff. Like, it's not just about opening the Encyclopedia Britannica and figuring out what the information is. It's like certain sections are taped off and the pages are glued shut, It's like, you can't read this page. It's really hard to open this page. Like, that's how the DNA works in the cell. But then that DNA creates RNA, which we can also test in tumors now. And, that RNA leads straight to proteins. So the RNA pieces are easier to find. Huge genes that come together, like huge rearrangements, like ROS or RET or ALK, are easier to find by RNA testing because it's 2 very different genes and you can't sequence the whole thing. And then there's proteins too. So, ultimately it's the proteins that are causing all of the effects of these gene changes. It's on the protein level. So it's the protein EGFR, not the gene EGFR, that's causing cancer division or ALK or all the rest of them. And then there's other proteins that are on the outside of the cell that we're starting to look at and saying, some tumors have these proteins and we can make antibodies and we can start to target these antibodies on the outside that are not fundamental to the biology of the tumor. They're not making the tumor grow, but they just happen to be there and a convenient target to use.
So by sheer fact that they're there makes them a target.
If it's different than self, it's a good target for anti-cancer therapy. Right?
Interesting. So now you guys know kind of when we started this by saying that no one single cancer is the same, right? And why it's so important that this type of testing be done, but not only that it be done, but that it be sort of analyzed and then your treatment plan be put out by somebody who can easily understand it. So let's go to biopsies. You mentioned tissue and liquid, and I think this is an important area because liquid is sort of newer to the game. And I think there's some confusion and quite often discrepancies on how and when it's being used. So in your opinion, let's talk about the 2. Do you do both at the same time? Do you do one over the other?
Newly diagnosed patient with non-small cell lung cancer, more likely adeno. Like most of the lung cancers that we see in the United States, and especially in the Bay Area, tend to be adenocarcinomas, probably due to the relative low levels of smoking around here. So they're just kind of randomly occurring cancers, truly randomly occurring. Can blame air pollution or whatever else we want to say, radon. You know, whatever caused it, we have to say, how do we figure out what those genetic changes are? And, you know, there's a lot of anxiety with that diagnosis of there's a mass, maybe there's metastases. How do we figure this out? So liquid biopsies, you know, blood, looking for abnormal pieces of DNA, because remember, these DNA changes are not self. There's no EGFR mutations, you know, with rare exceptions, you know, kind of in people without cancer. So if you find an EGFR mutation, even if it's 1 out of 10,000 EGFR sequences, it's unusual. Right. So, you know, that's how the liquid biopsy works, is by determining, in general, this shouldn't be there. But not all tumors are releasing DNA. For them to release DNA into the blood, they have to be dying. And I like to think about cancer sort of in that, you know, growth signals and death signals. I like to think about them as sort of like a slight balance toward growth over dying. Like, tumors are not healthy. Like, I want to think of them as very sick objects, you know, that we can change that balance very slightly. So when they're slightly growing, they're also dying a lot. Like, a lot of the tumor cells are dying. So we know cells can grow every day or two, but lung cancers grow over periods of months, not days or weeks. So that death leads to DNA coming out, and that DNA we can find in the blood. So liquid biopsies are easy. You can do it from a normal lab. It takes, you know, about a week for results. But if it's negative, it's not necessarily definitive. If you sequence the haystack for needles and don't find a red needle, that doesn't necessarily mean you found all the needles, right? Or maybe the needle wasn't even in there from the tumor.
So just to kind of recap for those that are watching, so liquid biopsies as they stand today are a very great and amazing tool. And they came on fast and furious, right? Which is fantastic for those whose tumors are literally shedding into their bloodstream. But just because you don't see it there, it does not mean it's not there. So then that's where tissue is still sort of the gold standard.
Right. And to do a liquid biopsy, they're not diagnostic for a type of cancer. Just because there's a mass, usually we want to know that it's cancer before we do a liquid biopsy and say, what kind of lung cancer is it? Once we have the tumor, if we have enough tumor, then we can do rapid tests or kind of DNA sequencing within a few weeks to be able to say exactly what kind of lung cancer that is. So, you know, the gold standard, if there is tissue, is the tissue testing, DNA. Even RNA that I alluded to, which is a little more sensitive for some of these really rare rearrangements. But the liquid biopsy can be fast and convenient. So many of my colleagues say these are complementary, and, you know, it's all about timing, right? When was the CT done? Where was the biopsy done? When does somebody see a medical provider that orders these tests and make sure they're done? And there is a lot of variability, even in Northern California and around the United States and around the world, in terms of what testing is done and what the sequence is. Because, you know, this path from first evidence of lung cancer to having all the information for treatment is different for each person.
There are, in a lot of instances, more than one right answer for your diagnosis, right? And so I briefly want you to talk from your perspective about how you come to that conclusion, because I think it ties really neatly back in with this precision medicine sort of conversation. How do you choose? And this is we're still on targeted therapies, right? So, or maybe you don't have a target. Like, how are you choosing when you've got maybe a target that's got more than one drug that's been approved for it?
To back up a little step, you know, so I hope that the pathologists, you know, will create what we call, you know, standardized or synoptic reports, right? And that should be a standard for a pathologist reading out lung cancer anywhere in the country. That's one way that we standardize this. And kind of cue the pathologist, like, lung cancer needs more testing, right, of whatever that is at the institution. So then we say, okay, well, now we have the whole picture. So we've moved to beyond, you know, the testing is done. We look at the molecular testing, whatever the profile is. Hopefully we find a targetable gene, one of the ones that we already mentioned. And then in general, but with some exceptions, we'll give targeted therapies first. Why do we give targeted therapies first? There were a series of clinical trials, chemotherapy versus pill therapies. And for the most part, they showed that the pill therapies worked for longer. They tended to have a little bit better penetration to prevent brain metastases or shrink brain metastases that were there in general. But at the same time, chemotherapy works too. So chemotherapy is not a bad first option. Either order is okay. Like we talked about, the biggest problem is missing the target completely and never having access to it. So it's more talking about the sequence when you know about the target than it is talking about which one comes first. That's more of a nuance.
It's more difficult to look at changes after patients received IO or chemo. What data set would you ideally want to have access to? Would you want to be able to regularly look at the transcriptome? Like, what would you need to be able to be fully informed in that setting?
It's complex. So chemotherapy works on a very fundamental cellular level of preventing cells from dividing. So resistance can happen in a lot of different ways. Immunotherapy, it was an unexpected stroke of luck that immunotherapy worked. For the first time, we've been trying to get immunotherapy to work for 30 years in lung cancer, but it just so happened that tumors put up the shield sometimes. And by breaking down that shield, you can let the immune system get in. So there are a lot of data sets. There are a lot of patients treated with immunotherapy who volunteered for repeat biopsies 2 weeks later. Like, that's a tough sell, right? I'm getting on treatment and I'm getting another biopsy of my tumor. Try and figure out, is it working? Is it not working? What's the resistance? I think ultimately resistance to immune therapy is complex. People have collected resistance, but there's lots and lots of ways that the tumors can put up additional defenses. So what data set do we need? More people participating in clinical trials, a few people hopefully participating in repeat biopsies, which are tough. And unfortunately, liquid biopsies, which are really easy, don't yield the kind of information that we need.
Right.
Agree to it if it makes sense for you, but if your provider thinks it's high risk, then they won't recommend it.
So what do you prescribe for a patient who's had all the testing, tested for all of the markers, tested for everything, nothing?
Chemo plus immunotherapy, usually, and many different recipes and combinations of that, and hope that it works, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes, there is immunotherapy for people, high PD-L1 tumors and smoking history. Immunotherapy may have a 40-50% chance of response, and sometimes when we stop it, still no tumor comes back. We're seeing these long-term responses from immunotherapy. So immunotherapy is sort of the default apart from these targeted therapies.
I do want to jump into this sort of next wave space and some of the things that you're really excited about that are kind of coming down the pipe.
We've talked, for many years about all these targets, and we have many more, even 3 years into COVID, than we did before. So there's been research and developments going on. But some of the new and exciting things, so I think one example of a new exciting thing that we didn't really expect or see coming was the HER2 or Errb2 targeted therapy. Trastuzumab Deruxtecan, or since we can use trade names, in HER2 is easier to say. This is now an FDA-approved therapy in lung cancer, worked in breast cancer, high response rates in lung cancer, and it's a fundamentally different nature than any of the targeted therapies that we talked about, because it's an antibody to this protein on the outside of the cell, the HER2, an old antibody, one that was originally in I think 98 or something like that, trastuzumab. They bound it to a chemotherapy, so a chemotherapy target, a chemotherapy that's so toxic that we don't give it to people. But when you bring it to the cell, it goes into the cell, it kills the cell, and then what's neat about these antibody drug conjugates is some of these chemotherapies stick around after the cell dies and will go into the neighboring cells. So, even though there's one cell with the target that it bound to, it'll start killing, and we call this bystander killing, and it'll kind of kill around that area. So This is the first of an antibody drug conjugate, and it worked much better than pill therapies did. We tried a lot of pill therapies in HER2, but this one works a lot better in this form of lung cancer. There's a whole host of other antibody drug conjugates now, and we're calling these chemo 2.0, right? Bringing the chemotherapy. Nobody wants chemotherapy. When I talk about chemotherapy with patients, I'm like, nobody ever came into my office and said, I always wanted chemotherapy, right? Nobody ever said that
I
ever.
can't wait to try it.
Right?
Yeah.
But when you say, well, it's a more targeted chemotherapy, so it should get more to the tumor and hopefully have fewer side effects for you, or maybe we just can give it an effective higher dose because, we're giving a lot more to the tumor, but it's the same side effects for you as regular old chemo. That's could be better. So there's TROP2 is a new exciting target and doesn't seem to need testing on the outside of the cell. A lot of lung cancers have this. And there's many other antibody drug conjugates too. The other thing, Danielle, that we're excited about is kind of cell therapy. So in the same genre, taking the immune cells out of the body, which sometimes don't want to fight the tumor, right? And the tumor put up a shield, but they don't care about the tumor, or the tumor didn't even have a shield. So we're now doing genetic engineering technology where we can basically insert genes into the T cells, into the immune cells, teach them to fight the cancer and target a certain protein, and then go and do that. So we're doing that now. It works really well in leukemias and lymphomas. CAR T cells is what they call it.
Right.
And we have versions of those that we're using in solid tumors. So I think those are two of the really exciting things. Starting to use these proteins on the outside of the cell as the handles for killing instead of just relying on these, DNA and proteins on the inside in pills. So I think they're complementary approaches.
Well, I think it's fascinating when you refer to it as like chemo 2.0 and that it's targeted chemotherapy. Because to your point, most people when they hear the word chemotherapy kind of sink into their chairs,
They think
right?
that's it. The end.
And what we always tell people, and I'm sure you and your team do too, is that it's not your grandfather, your great grandfather's chemotherapy. Like the chemotherapies have come a long way, but more than that, the supportive therapies to sort of counteract any potential side effect profiles have gotten a lot better too. But when I think about targeted chemotherapy, it's not really a lot different than when I think about how far we've come from a technology standpoint, even in radiation therapy, right? The way they are able to pinpoint radiation therapy now is kind of how I think about pinpointing this chemotherapy. Like there's it feels so incredibly futuristic to me, but I think super exciting. I guess my question around these types of therapies are when are they used? Like what role do they play in somebody diagnosed with lung cancers sort of thing? Does it come first? Does it come in the middle? Does it come?
Most things that we try, we first try them after the standards of care in
Sure.
lung cancer and see if they work. So I think the TROP2 antibody drug conjugates, and there's a couple that are out there that have promising data and response rates that are higher than we expect for just single agent chemotherapies. I expect those to be approved in the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah.
But then once we find something effective, then we say, how do we move it up? Like, should we move it to the front line? And then, what's the benefit? And then what's the side effect too? Because some of these drugs, they're real chemotherapy and they can cause hair loss and they can cause neuropathy and they can cause those side effects that, we tend to not have in, lung cancer, adenocarcinoma because we have kinder, gentler chemotherapies. I think, a lot of the bad reputation of chemotherapy comes from the movies or, people that we knew a long time ago, but also people who know friends. And oftentimes the chemo that you notice is not the first chemo they ever tried, right?
Yeah.
If we do a really good job, nobody in the waiting room can tell that somebody else is on chemotherapy, right? That's the hope. And it's only when we're trying the stuff that's older and not as friendly that people notice.
Yeah.
And that's when you start to tell the story.
I think the bottom line about this conversation, and there's not enough time in an evening for us to really cover everything and all these exciting things that are happening right now. But I think the important sort of take home is very exciting things are happening and are continuing to happen. And I think from my experience talking to patients for the last 15 or 16 years is that they want that plan B, like what's my back pocket option for if and when my current option stops working for me. And I think you've discussed tonight a lot of ways that we have kind of come down sort of, the highway, I guess, if you will, of therapies that have become options and only looking at some more really exciting things. And I think the last thing I want to say, and I would love for you to comment on, and people who know me know I tout this all the time, is this sort of clinical trial space. Because just like chemotherapy, clinical trials aren't your grandfather's or your great-grandfather's clinical trials. As Joel said earlier, you're either getting standard of care, and/or, trial drugs. So I think it's incredibly important, and one of the things I want to do for those in the room and those who are watching is say thank you for those of you who have participated, because I think that's a very big missing piece of the clinical trial process, is actually having these conversations with the people who are participating in them, letting them know what's going on throughout in a very respectful and timely and meaningful way. But more importantly than that, thanking them when they're done and letting them know what the results were. I mean, I think I hear this all the time. Like, these are still some gaps in this clinical trial space, and the patients, they're participating, they are giving back of their time and their bodies, and they want to know kind of what happened. So thank you from the bottom of my heart, and the docs out there like Dr. Neal for participating in these studies, because it is so incredibly important in order to keep moving this needle forward. Before I do my thank yous, and I already went through the living room things, I think a lot of you, and this is mostly for those of you in the room, and any of you who may have been on the road, remember Rocky Robinson. So Rocky was our backhand, like the right hand, the front hand, I don't know, the left hand, all the hands of this production coming out of that back room. And we unfortunately and very unexpectedly lost Rocky last month. So I just want to give a shout out, not only to him in remembrance, but to Penn Media and this crew, who's a new crew to us, for coming in today and really pulling it off without having our dear Rocky in the background. And he will be greatly missed, but a huge thank you to all of you for stepping up and pulling this all together. A big, huge thank you to Dr. Joel Neal. Give him a huge round of applause. Like I said, we hope he will be back soon to come and sort of finish this conversation. I think it was a great conversation. Thank you all for participating. Thank you for being part of this. Again, to Penn Media, Onyx and Ash, all of the go-to staff, Michelle Zay over here, who is literally my right hand in ensuring that this program comes off without a hitch. Could not do it without her. And I would be very remiss if not giving a shout out to our supporters. So Amgen, AstraZeneca, Boehringer Ingelheim, Bristol Myers Squibb, Daiichi Sankyo, Eisai Foundation Medicine, Genentech, Janssen Oncology, Merck, Mirati, Novartis, Regeneron, Sanofi, and Takeda. Obviously, that's a very long list of people who believe also in what we are doing and how important it is for all of you. So thank you. Get some coffee, get some wine, have some cake, and we will see you all next month.
So I'll be brave if you're brave. I'll be brave, but only if